I get a real treat today, a double treat. One, I don't have to talk about me, and I don't have to talk about what I'm doing or what my solutions are. I get to talk about my hero, um, and let him share with you what's inspired me, and the person who really is in my adult life responsible for my development as a human being, as a moral leader, as somebody with who appreciates ethics and values, who's learned to laugh at himself, take the world seriously but not yourself, who's learned to talk to difficult people, and who's learned to continually upgrade his software every day, because there's always somebody to learn, something to learn, and somebody to learn from, and to appreciate history. I've learned all that and much more from Ambassador Andrew Young. I've also learned how to appreciate um, the humble walk. I'm not a humble person only because as an entrepreneur, it's hard to be humble when people are telling you what you cannot do. So I'm constantly pushing through walls and saying, I will do this, over it, around it, through it. I will do it. And please step out of the way. Otherwise I'll run over you with no malice intent with my ideas. But you can't have humility in the midst of all that. And that humility of, I'm going to do it, but I'm open to you to tell me how to do it. That's what I've learned from Ambassador Young, and how to build something, not just talk about it. Ambassador Andrew Young um, is the last living lieutenant of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I want those watching your, I think, historic program, but very few people get the chance to engage with Ambassador Young as you're about to do. And he's sitting in a historic office, by the way, the same office where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the civil rights leaders met at his home. That office he's sitting at, I know it is in his home. I know I cleaned it out years ago and found his UN passport crumpled underneath one of the legs of his desk, which he had dismissed as not important. It needs to be in the Smithsonian, along with all the other stuff that's sitting in his house. But he was on that balcony with Dr. King when he was assassinated. He's one of the guys pointing in that famous picture at the shooter in Memphis. Took him years to go back to Memphis. I talked to him about going to Memphis, and he said, I'm just not ready yet. He goes there often now, but it took him a while because that was his friend who was killed, not just this global icon that we refer to. That was his friend. And they had a light moment that day where they had a pillow fight, which maybe he'll tell you about when he starts talking, where Dr. King was very jovial and very relaxed, unlike himself that day because he was under so much pressure. It's as if he knew that his days were numbered and he had let it all go. And the night before that, he'd given an incredible speech where he literally collapsed in his chair, and Dr. King and Ambassador Young and others had to brace him at Mason Temple Church in Memphis. You can watch that on video the day before he was assassinated, the night before he was assassinated. And Ambassador Young has what I call survivor's guilt. He thinks that the money wasn't his, so he gives it all away. The prominence wasn't his, so he uses it for the greater good. The brilliance isn't his, so he must lend it to the public. He thinks that he's mayor. He won't say this. Mayor, governor, mayor, ambassador, congressman, all this stuff, because his friend died. And he must thus be a giver. 130 honorary doctorate degrees. Let that sink in. I have 2. 130 honorary doctorate degrees. First congressman, first Black elected to Congress in the South since Reconstruction. Mayor of Atlanta, 2 terms. Built Atlanta into the only international city in the South. Let that sink in. Atlanta is the only moral city in the moral capital, really, for the U.S. I think arguably the world. And maybe the place, maybe Norway, the capital of Norway would qualify because of the Nobel Peace Prize, but really it's Atlanta. He brought in the Olympic Games, the Atlanta Olympic Games, co-chaired it, brought those in because of his international reach at the UN, helped to get Jimmy Carter elected. Reverend, pastor, teacher, congressman, mayor, uh, first Black UN ambassador in the history of the U.S., uh, President Medal of Freedom awardee. By the way, we had 3 here in Atlanta. He's the last living of that as well. French Foreign Legion awardee. I think you get it, so I'll stop. I'm actually surprised he's let me go on for this long. He must be actually taking notes, because otherwise he would have interrupted me by now. He doesn't like anybody talking about him. And I love bragging about him, because I think that the world needs to listen to what he's got to say. We talk about history. He's lived it, and he's made it.
That's a nice way of saying I'm old. But let me cut you off. You've said more than you needed to say. But what I have learned that crisis is also an opportunity. And there's never been a time in my life of 88 years that we have had as many crises nor as much opportunity. Now, the challenge to us is, how do we put these together in the midst of all of the confusion? And just to summarize, I got a call from Tanzania. They've got the crisis of Corona. A good friend of mine in Italy, I was worried about, and I called him. He's there. I mean, this crisis spread around the world, and it did it amazingly fast. And there's almost no place that this little worm has not infected people seriously. So if there was ever any thought that you could have a world in isolation, the corona virus said, that's nonsense. You know, we are all of one blood, all of the nations of the world. And there's almost nothing we can do about it. So we just as well appreciate it. The other thing is that crisis in the virus has created an economic crisis for us here in Atlanta. We have the world's busiest airport. That airport last year had 107 million flights landing. 107 million passengers. We land 125 flights every hour. Beijing is second with 92 flights an hour. And so this year, because of the virus, we might not have but 30 or 40 million passengers coming through that airport. We'll be lucky to have that. That means that we've got an economic crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And we haven't done anything bad, you know, to make it happen. This was not greed on the part of anybody. This was a health crisis that has, you know, really taken the base out from under our economy. And then on top of that, maybe it's the sins of the fathers on the third and fourth generation. But I think Isaias was the 9th tropical storm to hit the United States this year, and it's just the 1st of August. Normally, these storms don't start until the end of August, and we have maybe 8 or 9 in the course of a year. We've had 9 already by the 4th of August. And so what this crisis climate does to us is still an unknown. Now, in the midst of that, we had the world witness the murder of a young man by a policeman putting his knee on his neck. And everybody in the world saw that for 8.5 minutes. That's comparable to the beating on the bridge in Selma in 1965, or the little girl walking down the road nude in Vietnam, having had her clothes burned off of her. And we saw the little girl walking down the road on the cover of Life magazine. And suddenly everybody said, no, we don't like this war. This is not who we are. And the war stopped. I think that people said the same thing about voting rights when John Lewis and Hosea Williams and others, I had been given instructions not to lead the march, but to stay at the back of the line, because actually, the march was on the wrong day. It was a mistake. And the only reason Dr. King wasn't there was that it was the first Sunday, and he was in his pulpit on the first Sundays always. But that was a leap year, and we got it confused. But if that march had not been on the wrong day and Dr. King had been there, it never would have happened that way, because President Johnson would have had federal monitors and there would have been some element of restraint. So you never know what's shaping our history. And I've come to think that tragedy, crisis, we've got to see as an opportunity. And I began to call, you say conscious capitalism. I'd like to put another letter in there, conscience capitalism, to add that moral question to it. But I called it in Atlanta public purpose capitalism. And it's the same thing, but basically we had no money when I became mayor. And there was a deep debt in the federal government in Washington. The state never really outgrows its capital. And the city has to basically pay for its own growth and development. By defining the purpose for which we needed money, and at that time it was the airport. And everybody agreed on that public purpose. So we were able to go to Wall Street and float tax-exempt municipal bonds that funded that airport. And it has more than funded the airport year in and year out. And everybody loves those tax-exempt bonds. Why, I'm not sure. But even though I issued them for 8 years by the hundreds of millions of dollars, I've never been able to purchase one. I wanted to put something on my wall just to show how we generated all of this wealth. But they're gone so fast that even as mayor of the city for 8 years, I was never able to buy one, because people are so anxious to have good investments. So I think that that's sort of the way I see this climate. This climate is one of the most complex tragedies of our time. But that means it's one of the more opportune moments of our time. And that what the world is looking for, we decided in Atlanta, was a combination of, you had to have a place where your investment was safe. Well, the United States kind of guarantees that safety and security to wealth. But you had to also make sure that it was honest, that you didn't have to pay anybody under the table for anything. Then it was efficient, so that if we agreed on a time that we would have the permits issued, they had to be issued by that day. And so if you can create an environment where your money is secure, where it's being honestly administered and timely and efficient, there's enough capital around the world solve almost any of the problems we face. And it's just a matter of creating or discovering the kinds of environments that are calling for growth. And in the United States, we have the largest market in the world, but we also are crying out for better education. We're crying out for better race relations. And instead of talking about race, I'd rather talk about essential workers. Not that Black lives do matter, but the term essential workers has, for me, been a godsend, because it puts the doctors and the nurses and the teachers and the water workers in our city and the law enforcement officers. You cannot have a healthy city if you don't have good garbage collection. I mean, it's just a fact. And I think Dr. King going to Memphis, I think knowing he was going to be killed and wanting to identify with the least of these God's children, who were the sanitation workers of Memphis, wanted to say to us that everybody from top to bottom is essential. In fact, one of my favorite books is the book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And that the investments at the bottom of the pyramid always, spent, give us a solid foundation and help us build the pyramid to the top. But you've got to have that solid foundation, and that solid foundation is the essential workers. And so they have to have good health care. They have to have good education. They have to have homes and families, and that this is a time for us to sort of come together and meet the global needs, one issue at a time, or one place at a time. And I think that's conscious capitalism. That's public purpose capitalism. That's capitalism of conscience, as well as consciousness. It's conscience because it's money invested in the best that we have to offer. And it's helping to build an economy up from the bottom, where the hungry can be fed, the naked can be clothed, the sick will be healed, and we set at liberty those who are oppressed. And I think all of those things can be done and must be done with a free market economy. States haven't done too well with it, but we've done fairly well when we have understood that promise can be profitable, and that meeting the needs of all of God's children is the most certain way to build a society that we can all be proud of, that can be both peaceful and prosperous. And that's more than enough for me to say. But that's sort of, and I'm a preacher, but I don't want to preach too long. But I go back to, well, the prophet Isaiah saying, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he will strengthen your heart. They that wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get weary. They will walk and not faint." And I think this might be a moment of waiting. And this collection of ideas and people and needs being able to be brought together by these electronic machines I think, is opening us up, waiting for the new ideas, the new technologies. And I guess my favorite book of late is The Future is Faster Than You Think, by Peter Diamandis. And the reason is that it's very easy to get depressed when you're looking at the problems. But if you see the future moving faster than you think, you realize that these problems can become opportunities very quickly. Mm. And that all of the answers are present in the visions that are shared by the brightest and best amongst us. But we need a few moments to understand the problems in depth and to allow our technology to coalesce around our money and our ideas and our people to put the world back to work again.
Ambassador Young, Allison asked him a question. You mind?
Please go ahead.
Ambassador Young, two things that listening to you. One, people listening to this, CEOs, leaders, founders of companies, might be saying two things which might seem odd to you. One, they might say, gee, what can I do? I'm one person. Or they may say, I'm in the private sector. I'm not a mayor, I'm not a congressman, I'm not a senator, I'm not the president. You know, what can I do? I'm just a guy out here or a lady out here creating some free enterprise opportunity. There's two thoughts that hit me in that I would like you to opine on. One, you are coming back with Dr. King from Norway, where he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong here, you were coming through New York and you wanted to meet with President Johnson. And President Johnson, what Dr. King did, President Johnson really didn't want to see Dr. King because he was fearful that he might have asked for something else. And he was like, I'm done. Like, I've given you one civil rights bill. That's all I can do. And I think Rockefeller loaned you a plane or something to get to DC from New York because Johnson gave you a last minute appointment in the residence at night so no one would see you. And you guys had a very interesting interaction with Johnson that where Johnson told you in the King something that was actually misrepresented in a movie, by the way. You know the facts, you were there. And then Dr. King said something to you when you left that was a defining moment for that other moment you mentioned with John Lewis on the bridge. When you finish with that, because your brain is so crisp, can you also walk them through the role you played in those small towns after Dr. King protested, he did something with the private sector or asked you to do something, which might give these CEOs a sense of how important the private sector's role was in desegregation. Let's step back to the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, let me start with that and go, because that was 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. And we went to Birmingham because there had been 60 bombings of homes of Black people and no response. Fred Shuttlesworth's church had been bombed on three different occasions. And it was our effort to say that civil disobedience and nonviolence is fine, but it can't be passive. And this was our effort to make it more aggressive. Well, we knew what we needed to fight and what we needed to deal with, but we also had to get the community involved, business community. So as soon as we went there, Dr. King said to me, he said, Andy, do you know any white folks in Birmingham? I said, no, I haven't been to Birmingham before. He said, well, see if you can get to meet some. Now, that was before we started any demonstrations or anything else. And because I'm basically an active in the church, I went to the Episcopal bishop's house, the Carpenter House in Birmingham, where I thought I had met some young people a few years before, and sure enough, that was the place. And they introduced me to the bishop. And I asked the bishop if he would meet with Dr. King, but that what Dr. King was going to ask him to do was to convene meetings with the business community there at the Episcopal Diocesan House, which was a private sort of sacred building that everybody respected. And so while everybody read about the demonstrations in the streets and the dogs and the fire hoses, after that was over, it was my job to walk another couple of blocks back to the Episcopal Church House, and in the afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock, members of the private sector would come there to meet to discuss how we were going to work to resolve this. And we were actually able to do that in Birmingham. We got 100 businessmen to agree on what needed to be done, and each of them did what they could afford to do in their businesses. And we put the community together after the demonstrations and everything had torn it apart. Because part of the demonstrations meant that nobody was buying food or medicine for 90 days. But so there was an attempt to stop capitalism until we could renegotiate the relationships between the customers and the business community, and eliminate some of the burdens and stigma that race had created. But what we found was that personal relationships were really not nearly as bad. It was the state's legal relationships. And so the business community in Birmingham actually agreed to violate the state's laws to desegregate their businesses. And nobody ever complained. Now, going to see President Johnson,
Ambassador, hold on one second. It's important to note here, Alex, and we've never done this conversation in this way before. So this is the first. I'm glad you're recording it. This goes back. So some of your viewers should be saying, how did we get this screwed up? And that's right, because in the 1800s, blacks got the right to vote. In the 1800s, blacks got the right to accommodations and all that stuff after the Civil War. But when Lincoln was assassinated, the jerk that took over as president cut a deal to take all federal troops out of the South so that he might win support from the South. And the removal of the troops from the South allowed, and he basically said to Southern governors, you can do as you like, we won't interfere. And that allowed for 100 years something called Jim Crow laws to creep up in the South, where you had local statutes and in some case state laws in direct conflict, Alex, with federal law, in direct conflict. And what Dr. King did and Ambassador Young did, and this is why this is so historic, they laid their life on the line to bring federal troops back into the South, along with the Justice Department, along with media cameras, along with...
Well, we brought the media cameras and the Justice Department. We really didn't want federal troops. But what we found was that when 100 businessmen in almost any city will agree to anything, everybody falls in line.
That's right.
And I remember not long after that, I was making that same statement in New York, and Harry Oppenheimer was there from South Africa. And he came up to me and he said, you talk about this in the South. What do you think would happen in South Africa? Do you think 100 businessmen could help change South Africa? I said, absolutely. I said that business and government are partners, but really the ones with the money are the senior partners. And government usually follows what the business community thinks is best for business. And sure enough, he invited me to come to South Africa to make that statement. And by that time, I had become the ambassador to the United Nations, and I did make the statement. And we did help South Africa through the Chamber of Commerce bring its businesses together to negotiate Nelson Mandela getting out of jail and creating a peaceful path to majority rule. I think most will agree that with all the problems that have come with majority rule, that still South Africa is stronger business-wise today than it has ever been. And that there is a good relationship between business and government. And they work more on the problems together than being against each other. But I was saying that when we came back from the Nobel Prize speech and went to see President Johnson, he was discouraged because right after just before we were there, all of the generals in McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and all of the war hawks who were pushing the war in Vietnam were in there before us. So he'd been there for about 3 hours and trying to find a way to get out of Vietnam. And we come in talking about Voting Rights Act. He was really very discouraged and depressed. And he simply said, which was true, that I just passed the Civil Rights Bill 6 months ago. I can't go back to Congress. I really don't have that much power. I agree with you, but I don't have the power. And when we left, we didn't argue with him, but Dr. King said, we've got to find a way to get the president some power. And I thought that was very arrogant.
You told him that, right?
I told him that. I said, come on now, you guys who go to Morehouse, they say you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much. I said, that's the most arrogant thing I've ever heard you say. I mean, here you are, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and you're going to get the president some power. You don't have any money. You don't have any troops. You know, we hardly have enough voters registered to carry Atlanta.
No payroll money for next week?
No money in the treasury for our staff, and you're going to get the president some power. Well, what I didn't realize was, and I don't know whether, I don't want to offend anybody, but I realized walking out of the White House that he was not thinking economically or politically. He was thinking spiritually.
Mm.
And that there is a spiritual dimension to all that we do. And he was thinking that somehow we could get the president some power. It actually happened that way because 2 days later, Ms. Amelia Boynton drove over with 3 young preachers from Selma, and they described the horrors of race relations in Selma. And we decided that we would go to Selma right after Christmas. Well, in 90 days, from the 2nd of January to the 28th of March, the demonstrations in Selma, the fact that 2 or 3 people were killed, the attention that came to, and it was what I call, it was a divine coincidence that on the very day that we marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it was cold and rainy, freezing rain in the northeast, and everybody was at home and they were looking at a film on television about Nazi Germany and the judgment at Nuremberg. And after looking at 2 hours of the horrors of what happened in Germany, it cut immediately to Selma. Mm. And I think it was one of those divine moments, you know, like the death of George Floyd, that everybody witnessed. And they said, this happened in Germany. We can't let this happen in the United States of America. And it was a change of consciousness that changed the nation and changed the nation's politics. I always leave room for the spirit in the affairs of humanity. And I never know how it's going to work out, but I always know that, well, Ralph Abernathy used to say, I don't know what the future may hold, but I know who holds the future. And so, because I have faith in the one that holds the future, I know that somehow we are going to be able to work through these challenges. And these very challenges that right now are getting us down will be the opportunities that lift us up.
Alex, over to you.
I just want to express my gratitude for you being with us, Ambassador Young. There was so much powerful ideas and anecdotes in there that was spiritually powerful unto itself. And I want to invite anyone who's listening. We're going to start taking Q&A. You'll notice a Q&A box in the bottom right of the Zoom. Feel free to start typing them in. But I will ask you myself, Ambassador Young, what do you see as the greatest opportunity that we have right now, given the many challenges, the complexity of the challenges that we're facing as a country and a world?
Well, the word that pops into my mind is infrastructure. Because I grew up in New Orleans on the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River infrastructure has been neglected for, well, I was 4 years old when the Dutch technology was put into the river in New Orleans, moving on up all the way up to Minnesota. And it was 1936, 37, 38, when Franklin Roosevelt had the Civilian Conservation Corps. And all of these young men who were unemployed in the Depression were down there in Louisiana and along the Mississippi, building up the levees to stop the river from flooding. Well, we really haven't done much with it for 80 years. And the Dutch plan was only supposed to work for 50 years. And so we're 30 years overdue. And so the storms that are hitting now are causing much more damage because we have not done the infrastructure along the river. Now, when I say the Mississippi River, I'm talking about a 2,000-mile stretch from New Orleans to Minneapolis. And when you add the tributaries that flow into it, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, the Arkansas River, the Mississippi River borders on 31 states. And so this is the heartland of America. You have some of the best universities. You have more than half of the Fortune 500 companies are along that river. You have much of our food supply. In fact, 40% of the world's trade comes down that river. And so to me, that is one of the places of really great neglect. But that also makes it a place of great opportunity. And I have been, well, John and I went to see President Bush at the time of Katrina.
Nice man.
Which, was when we wanted to get started on it, but well, there were other things going on all over the world that were more immediately challenging.
And you also cursed me out before we went to go see him on that financial literacy thing. We'll cover that later.
No, but anyway, it's
you got to go see him about Katrina. Go ahead.
No, that I can't think of a safer place to invest.
Yeah.
And I can't think of, but I must confess that the politics in that region is not ready for investment. We've organized 96 cities between New Orleans and Minneapolis, but they're not coordinated with the states, and the states are not coordinated with each other. And we really need the leadership. We need leadership to kind of put together some vehicle that can get the Corps of Engineers, which is a government military body that's in charge of the river. But the government will not give them any money. The private sector will not give them any money. But the 96 cities along the river can't receive investment till somebody fixes the infrastructure of the river. But all of the technology is there. There's more than enough money there. And it may be that these three crises coming together, a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis.
Well, then you go to the social justice crisis, AY.
Well, I was leaving that alone. And I was leaving it alone because I think that I think that when you focus on the economics and the infrastructure, you reach everybody. The flood does not know any race, creed, or class or color. And that hurricane that went up, that's the quickest I've known a hurricane to go from Florida to Canada in a weekend. That's not happened before. You let a hurricane like that come up the Mississippi River, and well, the damage when the flooding hit around Houston 3 or 4 years ago ended up being $364 billion. That's a terrible waste. In Iowa, on the north end of the river, 70% of the cities along the Iowa River flooded last year in the midst of the political debate, and nobody talked about it. The chairman of the Senate Finance Committee is a senator from Iowa, and
unknown caller.
It's just
tell the White House you're calling back.
No, I don't know. Don't know that number. Excuse me. I'll get back to you later. But I don't know. Well, business requires a sense of timing. And I think one of the things that makes capitalism creative is you know, that 2 or 3 guys can get together in a garage and can come up with $1 billion idea. And then you get 2 or 3 guys with $1 billion ideas having lunch together, and suddenly they see something that they had not seen before. Or thanks to you, we probably have some great minds on this this call that are also managing companies that are producing great technologies. And they may not have thought of the Mississippi River as a market potential. And they might call you later or try to get together with us and say that I'm interested in that. I know that right now there's no shortage of capital in the world. Mm. And there's no shortage of technology. And there's no shortage of human need. But they're political and medical and climate and all kinds of things that are keeping it from getting together. Well, you got us together. And I don't know who we are, but out of something like this, something might be said that might be totally ridiculous, but it sparks something in the mind of one of our entrepreneurs or one of our financiers or one of our technologists that said, you know, maybe I can get together with so-and-so and we can do something about that. And that's why I think that, well, that's why I hang around and do these calls, because I do believe in miracles. And miracles are not, well, I don't know how to define. A miracle is people with conflicting backgrounds and different opinions all of a sudden realizing that they have the same problem. Yeah. And that if they come together, they have the technology, they have the money, they have the political will right now to do something. I don't think there's any shortage of need right now. And the need is basically crying out to people with ideas.
Didn't you say, one of your quotes was, coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous, right?
Yeah, that's what one of my grandmamas used to say. When you say that's a coincidence, she would say, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And
so giving a little friction here, and Alex, I got your note that you I guess we can talk for a couple more minutes. Is that right?
We would love that. I think we have the time for it if anyone else can stay.
Ambassador Young, you okay for a little bit more?
I'm fine.
Yeah, Ambassador Young and I, sometimes he allows me to disagree with him. And he's, whether he likes it or not, he's my surrogate father. And one of the things that we're going to disagree with this morning in a loving, respectful way is the issue of the fourth crisis. I think it's the third crisis, but really it's the third crisis of four crises. So you have the economic crisis, you mentioned, the health pandemic, the health global national and global economic crisis that's brewing. He would say the environmental crisis, which I agree with. And then I think you've got a 400-year-old social justice reckoning. He chose not to mention that, which might find people watching might find that odd, given that he gave his life with Dr. King on that movement. But he would tell you that was not a Black movement. That I'm gonna defend him first, and then I'm gonna disagree with him a little bit. So he would say that Dr. King would say, I didn't come here to save Black people. We came here to save America from herself. And Dr. King would say, we're here to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of war, racism, and poverty. It had nothing to do with Black people. He just said, unfortunately, Black people were starring in that particular show. I'm not going to disagree with him on the facts, because the facts, of course, he is right. But approach and texture matter. And this is where I go to the numbers. Black folks also star in another number. The reason I like math is that it does not have an opinion. Here's the facts. In 1850, the word millionaire was created in the world. It's created in New York City. Half of all GDP in New York City in 1850 was King Cotton. Cotton financing, cotton insuring, cotton import, cotton export, cotton manufacturing. That was coming from the richest city in the world in 1850 per capita, which is, hold on to your boots, Natchez, Mississippi, 1850. Wealthiest city in the world, which was the slave port that traded all of the incoming, most of the incoming slaves, and they had perfected there the cotton gin. When slavery was dying as an industry. Germany, Europe had done away with it, Britain had done away with it, the Caribbean islands were kicking it out, France had found that it was not as good for them as they had hoped, and they had lost what we now know, the Louisiana Purchase. Half of America is tied to the fact that France had to sell had to sell 13 states to America because they were financially bound up in another conflict in Haiti, where Napoleon's brother got his rear end whipped on the only battle that Napoleon ever lost. And that conflict caused them to go broke, and they had to sell America, basically America, which is the second intersection between Black people in this country, is that without that conflict in Haiti, we never would have got 13 states from France. But back to the story. What happened in 400 years ago is you had these folks coming from Africa who were not dumb people. They were geniuses, agricultural geniuses. And they would work this land. And here's the deal, Alex. America's deal is you work hard with this and you get the benefit of your labor. Every CEO watching this, their head should be going, yep, that's right. Here's what happened. We worked our tail off. My great grandfather was a slave. We worked our tail off for 250 of those 400 years. And the guy in the house up the street at the plantation got the benefit of our labor. It was a reverse transfer of wealth. That's my point. It's not about race. Not about black and white and this and that and guilt trip. No, it's just math. We worked hard, and the guy in the big house, his house got bigger. And to put this in a real crystallized context, about 10 years ago, JP Morgan Chase did a settlement because they financed, amongst other things in the 1800s, plantations. And they took as collateral, Alex, 1,300 slaves. And when 5 of the plantations went belly up, they had to actually take ownership of 300 slaves. JP Morgan Chase owned human bodies, as well as a bunch of other banks back in that day. So my point is that this is economics, and that's why 8% of the Black today, the average Black has a net worth is 8% of the average of their white counterpart, not because somebody's smarter or this or that and the other thing, but because you can't catch up with a reverse transfer of wealth of 250 years. What Ambassador Young is trying to do now I'm going to say something, I'm sure I'm not being eloquently quoting him. He's saying, look, I can't do anything about whether I was born Black or whether I was born white, or whether I was born rich or whether I was born poor, whether I was born free or whether I was born a slave, or whether I was a slave master or I was a slave. I can't do anything about that. It's where I was born. But what you can do is something today. Did I get that right, Ambassador Young? At least the last part?
Almost. And I mean, I agree with everything you say.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah. It's just that to talk about the guilt of the past, you get a resistance. I don't feel guilty for what my grandparents did or great-grandparents did. And that's why I was using the term essential worker.
Yeah.
That when you use the term essential worker, you're really letting people know that they cannot survive without what we now call the underclass. And I've been saying this for some time, that I used to say in the old days in the civil rights movement that Walmart would outlive Neiman Marcus.
Wow.
So, simply because there are more poor people than there are rich people. And it really was Walmart outliving Sears. See, because Sears left the poor people on the bottom, moved to the suburbs and the shopping malls,
went up market,
built the tall buildings
tried
in
to go
Chicago.
Up yep.
And they left the people on the bottom. And Walmart has been growing, and the wealth. Well, this book, Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, that they were trying to sell Tide in India, and they shipped all these boxes of Tide over, and nobody was interested in it. And they thought people are not interested in Tide, but they were sending the giant family size, and nobody could pay for it. But when they broke it down and sent the 1 rupee size package, they sold more Tide in India than they were selling in the United States. So that it's marketing to the poor, to the people at the bottom of the pyramid, that we had learned. Walmart learned to market
in a responsible way.
Huh?
In a responsible way, not
sure. Yeah.
Cashiers, rent-to-own stores, right?
No, it was a good product.
Yeah.
But you couldn't afford we buy the giant family size. But in India or Brazil, you've got to sell the 1 peso size, or the 1 rupee size.
Yeah.
And you can sell much more if you're marketing to the people on the bottom. And so just I don't want to get us involved in, I don't believe guilt is a Christian emotion. I think all men sin and fall short of the glory of God, and women do too. And there's no need in us going around, accusing each other. Let's have a no fault, no guilt analysis of looking at the world in which we live, and what's the best way now for helping the most people. And that's going to be the most profitable, and that's going to be the most creative kind of capitalism you come up with.
Now, Alex, imagine this. Forget all the other history that your people have just heard today. And I've done many of these sessions with him. You've gotten the best of him today. This has been a unique conversation. Imagine this. He saw his best friend assassinated by people he was trying to help. Confused, poor white folks. He was trying to help them. He was trying to love them. He loved them when they didn't love him back. He saw his friend's brains blown out on that balcony. And yet he says here today, no fault, no hate, no blame. It doesn't get much more pure than that in the form of love.
And I don't know if there's much more to be said. This sounds like a great point to just ask both of you, John and Ambassador Young, in the last few minutes that we have with this audience of conscious capitalists, is there anything that you haven't shared yet that you would like to share now, or that you want to emphasize as we wrap up this virtual gathering?
I want them to be able to ask a couple questions of AY, Ambassador Young, but I would just encourage each of them to go download the new Marshall Plan, investigate the work of Operation Hope, investigate the work of the Andrew Young Foundation, see how you can lean in with the Andrew Young Foundation, support what he's doing. By the way, he did this out of his heart today. He wasn't, to be blunt, no one paid him to do it. This is free. If you can support his foundation, I'm asking you to do that. Support this foundation before you even support me. Look at what Operation Hope is doing. Look what the Andrew Young Foundation is doing. See if you can lend your energy, time, talent, and treasure. Go on the internet and download the new Marshall Plan, which I wrote it, but I benefited from his mentoring when I wrote it. And see if you have a place in that plan that you can operationalize yourself, knowing that this private sector is the one that had all of the power to create change in the 60s in the last movement. What can you do? So I'll lead over to you for comments and questions from your members.
Can I just say this about the Marshall Plan?
The new Marshall Plan, yeah.
Well, I want to talk about the old one. Because I happen to be on my way to high school in 1944. And I wasn't a good student. And a friend of my mother's decided she was going to tutor me that summer. And she made me do a report on George Marshall's speech at Harvard University in 1944, I think. And that was the introduction of the Marshall Plan. And that Marshall Plan forgave Japan and Germany of all of their guilt. They did pay some reparations, but the emphasis was on restoring the world economy. And out of that came the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank,
yeah.
And a structured economy that has made the world what it is today and has made it possible for most of the people on this call might not be here if it had been for those events. And so it's not that I'm neglecting race. It's not, I happen to think that the market of the future is the African continent, that capitalism needs consumers, and there'll be 3.5 billion people on that African continent by 2050, and that anybody who wants to be in business in the next half of the century is going to have to look toward Africa. Well, in order to look toward Africa, the best thing to do is invest in historically Black colleges. And the best thing to do is to get young people who are Black from Africa coming here, sharing in the technologies of your companies, and then sending them back to help you access the market. That I think race is so important, as is class, that you can't get around it. Mm-hmm. But if you focus on it, everybody gets guilty, and guilt is a paralyzing emotion. Very few people do things out of guilt. They do much more out of a desire to serve.
Yeah.
Out of the motivation to help one another. And you help yourself when you help others. So I worry about the young people who are out in the street marching. Black Lives Matter. Well, Black Lives Matter, yes, but that and a cup of, and a 50 cents won't get you a cup of coffee even. And whereas the energy and vitality that these young people have mentally, and their own experience and enthusiasm, if you pull them into your companies and give them responsibilities that will help them earn money, they will help increase your profit margin and expand your markets. And we get more done racially when we talk about it less. And I mean, but that's just true. I mean, my wife can get me to do anything. Anything she says do, I will do it, unless she tries to make me feel guilty about it. And I refuse to be guilty. See, I refuse to let her shame me into doing anything. I'm too proud to be shamed. See, and I just think I think that's sort of human nature. And that the way you get, well, you catch more flies with sugar than with salt, or with honey than with, bitter. And so I just think that a no-fault answer to our problems is likely to be the most profitable answer.
As such wisdom you just said, Ambassador Young, I know we're going over, but we're going over with his acquiescence, Alex, so you don't have to feel bad about it. It's interesting he said that about no guilt. This morning, my wife and I were talking, and I was saying, I'm the only man in the world that can handle you, because you've got the will, the strong, solid, beautiful, loving will I've never seen. No man could handle you with me. And she said, you about will? She said, no one can handle you, period, including me. She said, basically, no one can get you to do anything you don't want to do. And I acquiesced to Shatra because I love her and because she's got my heart. But I started thinking about that. That is true. And so the only way you can get me to do something is to inspire me to want to do it. Otherwise, I will resent it. And everybody else in this call can relate to that. And inspiration is much better fuel anyway, by the way. Go ahead, Ambassador Young, and then we want to make at least one or two questions.
No, that's just it. That human beings have far more in common than the things that divide us.
Yeah.
And I've tried to find that common streak that we can all agree with, that would lead us to solve, that would lead us through these crises and turn them into opportunities, profitable opportunities of your conscious capitalism.